Mr. Harder.
Okay.
Is this what's called a phalanx of scientists? A legion or something?
This is how many scientists does it take to screw in a light bulb?
Okay. Would you like me to go ahead, Mr. Chair? Okay. So I'd like to just make a few brief comments about the science plan, where it came from. We've got a few PowerPoint slides here just to highlight some of the key elements. And then really what we'd like to do is to spend the time getting your feedback. This has just gone out for public comment as well. But we'd like to have a discussion with you. Where's this strong? Where would you like to see it? Before we come back with the second version of this for you. And first of all, I would just like to acknowledge both the Council and the Science Program staff for their efforts on this, and also the many other people that have stepped up and commented. You're probably aware that the state is still under furlough. The federal agencies are under sequestration. There's travel moratorium for just about anyone. So a lot of the face-to-face thinking has gone on evenings, weekends, holidays, things like that. And I think it's really a measure of the passion that the science community has to get this right. The fact that people, when they're already overworked, are willing to put in time and their advice to this effort. So what you see in the current science plan is a summary of all of the major components. We've received a lot of other thoughts and feedback that are not included there. So for folks who are listening in from a distance, just because you don't see your input reflected in here right at the moment, it isn't that we've set that aside. What we're trying to do is to get to the big issues for this framework about how we might do science across the entire system. Also, a couple of other general points. Where we started with this was with a detailed analysis of other major ecosystem management programs, many of which were at the meeting up in Puget Sound. Secondly, we asked the question that this is such an immensely strong science community. I think you have to come in from outside to fully appreciate that. The Chinese government just released a survey of the top universities in the world. 6 of the top 20 are here in California. And of course, there's many others that rank nationally in the top 50. That's reflected whether you're talking with the water contractors, with agencies, with the universities themselves. So there's this very high level of scientific debate, analysis, innovation. But despite that, and despite some very mature clusters of scientists working together on issues, there's almost an equal number of initiatives that you can go back and look at that were put out 5 years ago. Really great thinking, visionary at the time, and they went nowhere. So some of the questions we asked is, what happened? And finally, we are trying, to the extent possible, to reach out and employ some of the principles of community science in other areas of big science, where communities have been pulled together around very controversial issues. What mechanisms did they use to get to that point? A few of the examples: the long-term ecological research system, LTER, the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, what's going on in Switzerland, CERN, and particularly Gary Sanders, a professor of theoretical physics, has really got into this thing. How do you get large groups of scientists to work together to accelerate knowledge discovery in a way that's very defensible? And finally, we'd also like to acknowledge the Independent Science Board. They've made it perfectly clear in their last 2 meetings that they are going to be engaged in this process. They're very enthusiastic. They really bring a lot of experience and perception, and I'll try and touch on a few of their comments as we go through this. Just one comment, and we've received a lot of comments about this, and I just want to be perfectly clear. We have this name, One Delta, One Science. The One Delta people agree with, but I just want to be clear about what One Science means. One science does not mean you're going to see every scientist working on delta issues lining up and saying this is perfect. We fully understand that. In fact, if you look at how science is done, we need to embrace legitimate scientific disagreement. And Niels Bohr, the famous Danish physicist and great speaker, you actually once said that now we have a paradox or a significant difference of opinion. Now I can see us making some real progress. So we need to have a process where we embrace legitimate science disagreement. The stuff that is fluff or not important, how do we weed that out? So these are things that just went into the initial thought. Where we're coming from is, of course, the Delta Plan. I won't go through this again. It's just what the thoughts was. You were very clear about the role of science and what needed to be included in that. The other main guiding document is the National Research Council in 2012, and we thought this was just a great document. It really hit on many of the key issues. If you look at the recommendation GR1, this is just paraphrasing the elements that you broke down that needed to be addressed in that. In the science plan, how do you organize science? How do you communicate in a very clear way what likely responses are going to be? How are you going to manage data and synthesis, and how do you communicate that? Uncertainties and conflicting science information. How do you make decisions in the face of uncertainty? And the Independent Science Board had a very interesting discussion last week when they met about when is science good enough and how do you implement that into a plan. How do you prioritize research to get at those uncertainties? How do you develop shared computer models? The last thing we're suggesting is that there's just one supermodel out there. We embrace multiple models to accelerate understanding. How do you develop the shared body of knowledge that different groups and different decisions that need to be made can rely on? And also, you asked us to make recommendations on how monitoring could be integrated. This just deals with some of the status quo. Again, some of the elements which we guided a lot of our thinking. The synthesis is what the National Research Council came down on very heavily. Essentially what they were saying is there's really great science being done for specific science questions, often in a short term. But what is taking a look across the various programs? The scientific uncertainties are not excuses for inaction. And the clear understanding of trade-offs. If you're making one decision against another or comparing alternatives, having a clear statement of what that means. So this is the vision we started with and you approved at the beginning of the year. How do you build an open Delta science community that works together to build this shared body of knowledge? So some of these elements which we're going to touch on in a few minutes is how do you connect the decision makers with the leaders of science, the people that can speak on behalf of their disciplines? How do you build the infrastructure for delivering relevant science in a timely manner? So many decisions are recognized. If you look in the science report, there isn't time to go and do a 12-month study or a 24-month study. Decision makers need to know what's going on now. And so, again, to quote, this is the last quote from the NRC panel, how do you knit the science community and the policy team together? So you've seen these sketches before. Director Bonham of the Fish and Wildlife picked up this in a recent IEP meeting. There's a lot of good science going on. How do you develop that large blue circle? What does that mean? And then how do you link that directly to the policy?
Peter?
Yeah.
So what's the answer to that question?
What we're suggesting is a high-level group of those decision makers and the leaders of the science community, the leaders of the science program, so that those directors or the people responsible for the decision can get an understanding of what's going on, not just from their in-house scientists, but can address the much broader science community. And we'll talk a little further about this process in a moment, how that will actually work. But
Well, give me a hint. How would it work?
so, yeah, no, actually, it's a great question. So it will start out with a meeting where between the agency directors, the decision makers, and the science community to identify what are the really big questions. What are the uncertainties that are making those decisions so very difficult?
So what would be an example of that? You get a group of scientists, like people at this table together, right? And what would be a big question that they would want to address? What might be an example, just for illustrative purposes?
Okay, well, there's several that we could step into. One of the big questions could be, we're looking at a very major restoration site at a given location. What is the fish productivity going to be there as opposed to another region? Is that likely to achieve the potential outcomes? But Lauren or anyone else want to jump in with a few other examples?
Well, no, I actually kind of like that example. So there's an idea of creating some habitat in the South Delta, let's say. And you're going to evaluate how valuable that would be, or presumably whether it be successful, or what the investment would have to be, or what the potential problems might be, or side effects. Is that the kind of thing you'd do with a group then?
Right, so that's a big question. Yeah, how effective is that likely to be?
Okay.
Are the clams going to come in and totally nullify the effect
good.
of the wetlands?
Okay, so if that's the issue, how, and this is your expert group, how would they wrestle with that?
Okay, so with that, there's then a big question, and maybe there's a series of big questions like that. This group that has interacted with you as a decision maker will then take back those questions and begin to develop this next part of the science plan, which is the science action agenda, the work plan for what we're suggesting is going to be a 4-year period. So this is sort of looking out on the longer plan that is going to require a faster answer. So that is actually the science level, the science synthesis team. If the question that you've posed requires a much faster response, where decisions need to be made in short order, there's 5 different levels where we could get information from the science community back to you to make a reasonable decision, depending on the time frame that that decision needs to be made under. So it could be anything from, depending on the scale of the issue, it could be a literature review that would be coordinated by the science synthesis team. This is our best shot at what's going on. A second issue might be, if there was a little longer period of time, we could have an invited panel that comes in where the various groups that are working on that issue, as we do right now, present their various science, and then that group will work through it and come out with a series of recommendations. A third level, if there's a little more time, and as we've seen at the State Board, there's some big questions out there where there's a legitimate difference in opinion primarily because people are using different models and different data. So sort of moving up the scale of time and investment. We then have this mechanism modeled on the NC Center that would allow the question to be well defined. You then pull together the various groups who are doing science in that area. They have these differing opinions. You give them the resources like a biostatistician, the computational resources, access to the hydrodynamic models if that's part of the question. And under direction of the scope of what that group's set to do, you give them postdocs. And typically under the NC's model, you would need about a year. And then they come back with a synthesis finding on that particular topic. So it's a more collaborative type of effort than bringing in an independent panel. And the success of that being done here through IEP, as well as other big challenges. On some of these really big questions which we expect to see coming up, with big uncertainties, it's highly unlikely we're going to be able to address that issue right now. But we know it's going to be there 5 years, 10 years from now. It just needs more science. How do we begin to reduce those uncertainties? And that becomes through the science action agenda, where we begin to target research dollars to chip away at those uncertainties.
So for a given project in which or question that needs an answer in a relatively short period of time, you convene people, do a literature review, perhaps a panel, analyze if there's controversies in the science community about what is known or what should be known to decide if the project would be successful or not. And if it's controversial or there's insufficient evidence, then you might use postdoctoral students or commission other research. And that raises the question of how that would be paid for, but I get kind of how that might be done. And then for the bigger, longer term, more complex questions, you would kind of triage that part of the science agenda into thinking about what's needed over a period of years and try and direct other entities with money and resources to study those in some coordinated fashion. Is that?
Yep, that's right. So the conclusion might come back, we really don't know. This is where our understanding is.
Boy, you're lucky Hank's not here, because that wouldn't be a good answer.
Yeah, but I think we have to be honest. And there are issues out there which are very complex. You need to know what are the issues where maybe there's just opinion with very little scientific background behind it.
So I guess this is helpful. So a couple of thoughts in terms of the next draft is, to the extent that you can do a couple of examples to show how a medium or smaller kind of science-related question would be dealt with, and how the really large, complicated ones would have to be engaged, would be helpful. And then I'm not quite clear on who makes people do stuff, because my sense of the science community is it's very respectful of the independence and judgment of colleagues. And so how do you forge compromise, or, and I don't mean compromising people's integrity as to how they study an issue, but as to what will be studied, and how you can get to the point where the decision maker or makers get an answer. So how do you push scientists? And the term push is probably offensive to scientists, but when policymakers have a deadline and scientists have a culture and intellectual rigor that is on a different timeline. How do you match those?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question and something we've thought about a lot. So I think that there's two things. There's what is happening right now and where we may be, say, in 5 years' time. So right now there are science conflicts out there that need investigation. As we develop this community of science and a shared prioritization, I think we can agree what the big uncertainties are likely to be. What are the unknowns? And there's a fairly detailed process. As we move more towards that point, many of the issues I think we will be anticipating, because we'll be designing the science to be anticipatory of not all but many of those issues. So in answer to your question, so how do you get, there's a total difference of scientific opinion. It's going to have a very big possible outcome. Let's see, I think we've got a...
Peter, I want to weigh in, and we've had many conversations and traded a lot of information on this. To say that the first draft science plan appears to me to be very much like the first two drafts of the Delta plan is meant as both criticism, but also the fact that you can't do a complicated document without going through a couple of revisions. But for me, I hearken back to the old approach. Define a problem, accumulate the evidence, develop the alternatives, and then go on. And I'm struggling to make clear in my mind what this draft identifies as the problem. Let me tell you what I've found. On page 1 in the executive summary, you cite the National Research Council's very good 2012 report. Quote, line 13, currently, science efforts related to the Delta are performed by multiple entities with multiple agendas and without an overarching plan for coordinating data management and information sharing among other entities. On page 9, under the caption title, The Overarching Problem Addressed by the Delta Science Plan, you quote the Delta Plan, which says multiple agencies, multiple agenda without an essentially the same quote. But we also said, increasingly resource management decisions are made in the courtroom as conflicting science thwarts decision making and delays action. Multiple frameworks for science in the Delta have been proposed, but a comprehensive science plan that organizes and integrates ongoing scientific research, monitoring, analysis, and data management among entities has yet to be fully formulated. And then the very next section in this, and this is the long discussion, is what is quite important to you, organizing science to inform policy and management, not just scientists, but policy and management. And you quote the National Research Council again, a collaborative effort is needed where scientists and government professionals work together as a single team rather than two separate entities. Now, if the purpose of a science plan is to deal with the complications of scientific information at the intersection of science and policy, it's not clear to me that that's your focus. Number two, if multiple agencies with multiple agendas have been identified as the problem, continuing multiple agencies with multiple agendas seems to me to guarantee a continuation of the problem. And I'm not opposed to most of the specific actions you recommend in here, although they're hard to find because they're buried in text. And I think you were going to bring just the listings of the action items so the council could look at them. What will the Delta Science Plan either do or recommend to solve the problems of multiple agencies with multiple agendas, which as best I can tell you have defined as the problem? Now, if I'm wrong, if that's not the problem, tell me now.
No, that is certainly one of the major problems. And so there's two approaches to dealing with that. One is that you could try and repeat CalFed, create a single science agency. Our thought was that was not going to be pragmatic. The way that we're addressing that issue is through a common work plan for science, a common prioritization of what the big research questions are, and the ability to look out across all of the different programs that are currently looking at various parts of the science related to the Delta, your BDCP, IEP, the Riemann process, many of the other actions out there. Everyone has been thinking about what are these big prioritizations. The thought is that you can then take a look and push those together through the science synthesis team. So this is a group of the science leaders that will compile all of those research priorities that have already been identified. That would then be synthesized into what kind of science could you do to get towards those big questions. The policy science team that's part of this, what their role is to really ensure that when that science is actually conducted, the directors, the people on the policy end, can see what the outcomes are going to be from that science. Is that really going to get to the types of questions that they are facing? And so we're also seeing that that would help identify overlaps, duplication, or gaps in a full...
Is it just the hope that you get a bunch of people together and talk a lot, that they can, as Ms. Connor said in an earlier discussion related to the BIOPS litigation, that if you get a bunch of folks in scientists in a room and they start talking, they can define problems that are important, they can define alternatives that might be studied, tested, measured, judged, and out of that will come a basic body of knowledge that policymakers somehow pick up and start to act upon, one hopes. I mean, but you stated that the purpose of this is, and you cited the National Research Council working together as a single team rather than two separate entities. But I don't know, is the BIOPS a committee on which you sit also composed of water system operators, or is it simply science dealing with ecosystem issues?
Well, I think with that program, it's looking at both sides. But what we're trying to do here is that whatever you're looking at, many of the tools which people are looking at are very similar. And so that you see, for example, very well-intentioned studies going on using sometimes the same model, but looking at different scenarios with major overlap. So by developing the science action agenda, people can see where their science fits in to the overall picture. Where are the gaps? What models, what data streams do you need to answer your particular question?
Well, my last point at this discussion, I know, I hear you all, but also on your vision for the Delta Science Plan, on page 1, again, start, you use the sentence, it does not mean that the sovereignty of agencies is compromised, regulatory responsibilities are diminished, or bottom-up mechanisms for shaping the science community are lost. Now, I understand that the Delta Independent Science Board used the word sovereignty, which I point out is a legal word. It is not, I believe, a scientific word, and it means a sovereign, and it means supremacy. And the last time I checked, no government agency itself is sovereign. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is not a sovereign entity. We may be an independent agency of state government, but nobody complains we are sovereign. So, this seems like, if I can, I'll be as direct as I have in private. This seems like a recognition of the fact that multiple agencies with multiple agendas isn't going to change, so we shouldn't pretend it's going to change, and we trying to do the best we can in an imperfect world. Now, if that's the purpose, I recommend you say that specifically, because that would be at least refreshingly candid, even if depressing in its expression. I mean, put all that aside. This is just like the first and second drafts of the Delta Plan. I do think, however, you have to think about the structure and organization. The writing is not great. I've told you that before. The structure and organization of this has to lead the reader through a logical pattern, and there have to be a separation of what the Delta Science Program, existing agency, you've got state statutes and directions and duties and obligations under state law, under the Delta Plan, what you do from what you recommend others do. I mean, that's one of the lessons we had to learn in the Delta Plan. If you merge them all together, it either all sounds like a regulation or it all sounds like recommendations, and nobody can straighten it out. And it took us several versions of the Delta Plan to get to a more understandable format. And I think the science plan, because it is crucial, it's crucial to the Delta Plan. I think it is fundamental to policy. When we were back in Washington, people talked about the science plan, not just scientists, but policymakers. Now, they were admittedly over-optimistic of what it is. And I agree, as you scientists always say, politicians want science plans to make everyone happy, and scientists cannot be expected to make everyone happy.
That's not entirely true, because scientists do make us happy. Here's, there is scientific consensus on a wide range of things that we deal with in life. I think there ought to be, is there when you talk to a politician or you talk to a bureaucrat, you talk to us, we take certain things as, well, there's a consensus on this. And I don't want to make sense out of what I'm about to say, but it seems to me that there are things about which there is a scientific consensus, and that's the starting point. We're going into the unknown, and you're obviously exploring in a scientific manner to achieve certain levels of understanding that will result in certain types of action. But I back up to the consensus part. A lot of people say things, and I said, I'm sure there's a scientific consensus. That guy's full of hot air, or she's just doesn't understand what we're doing. I think it would be helpful if we understood, and we talked to a political individual, as we often do, but people that are critical of whatever we're doing, that we are aware there is a scientific consensus that we start with on whatever that issue may be relating, for example, to the Delta ecosystem restoration, whatever that happens to be. Is there a place for that type of understanding that you would say, look at folks, this is decided upon. We're out here, we're doing things that are much more important, but there are things that are understood and agreed upon by scientists. Maybe I'm off base here in this perception, but I would like to know those things that are given as opposed to things that are unknown or not certain. It would be a nice starting point for us. That may not be what this is about, but I would sure like to understand that.
Actually, that was expressed far more articulately than I did, but no, the common body of knowledge, and I think it was said very well in some of the recent State Water Resource Control Board hearings that we do know a lot, and that sometimes we forget that. So part of this process should be to identify here's where we know, and here's where legitimate scientific disagreement starts, because this is just a very complex open system.
Right.
And that's where we begin to target the resource and the research. But we can certainly make that a lot more explicit.
You turn your microphone a little toward you're talking away from it.
Oh, okay.
So I can hear better. There you go. Turn it towards you.
No, that's a very good point to make that stand out a lot more clearly. But certainly it's the intent under this common body of knowledge.
Randy.
If I could piggyback on Judge Damrell's question, the lower YOLO bypass, there is an effort underway to improve habitat. There's also a warning that's been sounded by federal EPA that there is a methylmercury issue as a result of attempts to do whatever is projected to be done to improve fisheries habitat. That's a real-life, modern example. Federal EPA has told us that's their number one issue in the Delta. How does the Delta Science Plan address the known of habitat is useful and helpful for fish, but to create the right type of habitat in the lower YOLO bypass, it presents a methylmercury problem. Can you apply the Delta Science Plan in its current form to solve that problem?
Actually, great example. And do you want me to go, Rainer, or do you as the expert in that?
Go ahead and I'll augment.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a number one issue. So we would see that being, for an agency, we see that coming out in the policy science team, first of all. This is a big issue if you want to go ahead and do restoration. That comes back then to the science synthesis team, which is broad representation of the science leadership. That gets on the agenda. What's the time frame that decisions need to be made on that? Because that will depend which of these avenues that you go on. Is there something ready to go this summer and it's likely to be held up because of this issue? If not, my guess is this is going to be more of a chronic issue. So under that science synthesis team, depending on the time frame, they have several mechanisms. Probably it would be a science work team that they would establish. Bring the best folks together, which agencies need to be engaged, who's doing the best research in the universities. And then what sort of mechanisms, there's a lot of flexibility in these restoration projects. How does that mercury get transformed to the point that it's bioavailable? What sort of measures could you include to minimize that happening? And come out with a series of options or alternatives, not just for that site, but maybe some hypotheses that can be tested into the future. And then that just gets listed in this feedback mechanism. But Rainer, do you have anything to add to that?
I'd love to add a few things.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that there are at least sort of three different steps of how the science plan addresses uncertainty. One is what Peter highlighted, where we really don't know a whole lot, where we need to do more research. The second one is where we know enough that we can go forward in experimental fashion, and the mercury problem is one of those, where we can do small-scale pilot projects that generate enough lessons learned where we know how to restore to avoid methylation of mercury and making it bioavailable to the food web and eventually to largemouth bass and striped bass and people, and higher trophic levels, as they're called, end consumers. So and then the third one is where we know enough that we can actually go ahead with large-scale implementation, but keep track of unexpected little surprises that we might see. So keep monitoring and generating information as you move forward with experimental actions or even large-scale actions like what's happening now with YOLO Ranch, the Lower YOLO project. So that's a big project. It's like 1,200, 1,300 acres of restoration design already in place. But as you move forward, you learn as you go, and you design the project, the implementation, and the actions in such a way that they enable you to learn, and you generate data as you implement. So that's really kind of the approach that we need to document and highlight in the next version of the Delta Science Plan. I think that message didn't come through forcefully enough. And Phil, please feel free to comment on that some more. But I think these three different phases and stages of research, basic science, where we know very little, then pilot stage implementation, where we go through this adaptive management cycle where we learn from our smaller scale experiments, and then larger scale implementation, designing it in a way where we can continue to learn over longer time periods and then continuously enhance our knowledge base.
Yeah. I want to join in with Frank's observation. If there is general consensus, and there is, you informed the Delta Plan on climate change, not just because there was a statute that said study 55 inches of climate change for BDCP, but because there is a vast body of scientific opinion that says the climate is changing and the impacts will be serious, sometimes unknown, and the timing is uncertain, but you have to take it into account. The other thing, and I forgot to praise you, as you know, the Appendix 1 in this draft document is the draft policy and procedures for independent scientific review panels. And the Delta Science Program, under the Council or for X number of years under the Bay Delta Plan, has developed a structure and an outline of how it's done. And to me, this was, if you're asking what's really a highlight, I just say this short 3-page paper, which reflects what you've been doing for years, is one of the most important guidelines, because almost everyone on major projects says, yeah, at some point there's got to be an independent review panel on something. And the document in Appendix A is short, simple, easy to read and understand, but it highlights issues that are crucial. It says the members have to have an absence of a demonstrated conflict of interest. Well, that seems to be implicit in the word independent, but that's the standard you've been using. You set up communications with the panels. Essentially, you can't legally prohibit, but you discourage communication by parties privately with the panel, and you urge open transparency to the extent possible. But then the other thing you do, which I think is even more important, is you specifically say that the science program, which appoints the panelist, may suggest grammatical or formatting edits, but will not otherwise substantially amend a review panel report. And then you say the content, substance, and recommendation of a review panel report are those of the review panel, not the Delta Science Program or the Delta Stewardship Council. Man, that's terrific. That is, you look at that, and you can argue about different things, but you say, yeah, that gives a fair shot at an independent review panel that might be able to contribute substantially. This is the tone, texture, and clarity on organizational side issues. And you understand you have a policy approach, but this is largely an organizational, structural document on science, not a conclusion of scientific issues. And that's the highlight and I think the best illustration, Frank, of what you're talking about. This is an approach that creates understanding. The understanding for policymakers, I'll put myself back in the role, all we understand is process. You guys tell us science, I might remember something, I've read some of these reports, but the fact of the matter is that with rare exception, policymakers are not scientists. Are judges scientists? Even judges on occasion are forced to study science, but they don't claim to be scientists. These processes you develop bridge that gap to policymakers and hopefully make the whole process more coherent and the outcome more beneficial to the public, which is what we're all struggling to do. So anyway, Don. Okay.